You are sitting at the bedside of someone who is dying, holding their hand, counting breaths that are becoming further and further apart. And in the second, when they take their last breath, you suddenly feel something, a lifting, a light with no source, a peace that has no reason to appear right now, when the person you love has just left. Most people who have experienced this never tell anyone, because they are afraid of being told it was shock. It was grief. It was their brain protecting itself from pain. But Dr. Raymond Moody, the same man who collected the largest body of data on clinical death in history, discovered something unexpected. This doesn't only happen to those who are dying. It happens to those nearby, to the living. And it happens so often and with such matching details that he dedicated an entire separate study to it, separate from everything he wrote about the death experience itself. Stay with me, because if you have ever been beside a dying person and felt something inexplicable, what you're about to hear will finally explain it. Moody called this the shared death experience, a phenomenon in which a living person present at someone's death experiences elements of the very same journey described by people who came back from clinical death. Not metaphorically, literally. The same tunnel, the same light, the same sense of presence, the same loss of fear. Moody began collecting these cases after noticing a strange detail in his main research. Relatives of people who had experienced clinical death sometimes told him things they shouldn't have known, because they hadn't experienced it themselves. They described details of the room where their loved one had been unconscious, described sensations that person had felt, and when Moody started asking directly, he found that this was happening constantly. Nobody simply talked about it out loud, because they were afraid of being thought strange or grieving so intensely that they had started seeing things that weren't there. A real case Moody documented and called one of the most compelling of his entire career. A woman was sitting at the bedside of her dying husband, final stage cancer. The family had gathered. Everyone understood it was a matter of hours. The moment his breathing stopped, she suddenly saw a tunnel, not with her eyes closed, not in a dream. Directly in front of her, overlaying the actual room, a sensation appeared of movement through dark space toward light. She described it not as a vision in her head, but as a perception layered over the physical reality around her. She saw the hospital room and the tunnel simultaneously, and at the end of the tunnel, a figure her husband had described to her a week before his death. His mother, who had died 30 years earlier. The woman had never seen her mother-in-law. She had died before they met, but the description she gave after this experience matched with striking precision. Photographs she only saw for the first time several days later, while going through her husband's old albums. This is not an isolated case. Researcher Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, one of the world's leading specialists in near-death experiences, built his own database of similar cases and arrived at a conclusion he stated extremely carefully, but unambiguously. These experiences are statistically too similar and too often synchronous with the moment of death to be explained away as coincidence or a psychological reaction to grief. If this were simply grief, the experiences would vary. Everyone grieves differently. But the descriptions given by different people in different countries who don't know each other and have never read Moody's research match with a precision that doesn't fit coincidence. The second type of case Moody documented with particular care, light seen by several people simultaneously, not one witness, several, in one room at one moment. A family had gathered at the bedside of an elderly woman dying of heart failure. 5 people in the room, a daughter, 2 grandchildren, a nurse, and a daughter-in-law. At the moment her breathing stopped, all 5 subsequently and independently of each other described the exact same thing. The room filled with light, not bright in the ordinary sense, soft, warm, with no source. Light that cast no shadows and came from no lamp or window. It lasted about a minute. Then it disappeared. The nurse, a woman who had worked in hospice care for 15 years and witnessed hundreds of deaths, said she had never experienced anything like it before and could not explain it professionally. Moody interviewed each witness separately, not allowing them to compare impressions before the interviews precisely to rule out the effect of mutual suggestion. The descriptions matched in their details. A color that wasn't on any object in the room, a temperature that seemed to change even though the thermometer recorded no change, a sense that time had stopped for a few seconds. But the strangest thing Moody collected of all, cases where a person felt the death of a loved one while being in a different room or a different city. A man was at work when his father was dying in a hospital 3 hours away. At 2:15 in the afternoon, he suddenly felt an inexplicable calm and lightness, a sensation he described as if someone had lifted a physical weight off him that he hadn't even noticed he was carrying. He looked at his watch because the sensation was so strange, he wanted to mark the moment. 20 minutes later, his sister called. His father had died at 2:15, exactly that minute. Moody collected dozens of cases like this, synchronous sensations at a distance at the moment of a loved one's death. Statistics, of course, are not proof in the strict scientific sense, but the number and precision of the time coincidences made even Moody's skeptical colleagues admit that ignoring this was becoming difficult. What does this mean in practice? Not philosophically, practically. If you have ever sat at the bedside of someone dying and felt an inexplicable peace right at the moment they left, that was not your imagination, and it was not a defense mechanism of your psyche. According to the data Moody collected, this is a widespread and documented phenomenon, and it changes how one should approach the moment of a loved one's death, not as trauma to be endured separately from the dying person, but as a transition you potentially participate in, not as an observer, but as someone who comes into contact with the process itself. Moody said in one of his final interviews that this particular research changed his own attitude toward being present at deathbeds. He stopped advising relatives to protect themselves emotionally by keeping their distance. He started advising the opposite, to remain as present as possible, to hold the hand, to speak out loud even if the person seems unconscious. Because if the shared death experience is real, then it is precisely physical and emotional closeness that creates the conditions in which it happens, not detachment, presence. One final question. If you were beside someone at the moment of their death, did you feel something you couldn't explain at the time? A light that shouldn't have been there, a calm that had no reason, an image that appeared and disappeared? Write it in the comments. Not so strangers on the internet can confirm it for you. But because sometimes saying it out loud for the first time is the only way to understand you weren't alone in that feeling, that it was real, and that perhaps, in that second, you weren't just a witness to someone's death. You were, for a moment, close to something far greater,